Hello and welcome to The Game Changers, the podcast where you'll hear from extraordinary, trailblazing women in sport. I'm your host, Sue Anstiss, and I'd like to start by thanking Barclays for their ongoing support of The Game Changers. There are a few brands across the world who are doing more for women's sport right now. Barclays are title sponsor of the Women's Super League, and they also back the FA in the fantastic work it does to ensure that every schoolgirl across the country will have the chance to play football by 2024. I'm really excited to introduce my guest today, Dr. Pippa Grange. Pippa is an influential sports psychologist and a culture coach working across elite sports and business internationally. She believes relationships are at the heart of everything and the antidote to fear. As head of people and team development at the Football Association, Pippa worked closely with the England team for the World Cup in 2018. And although she's very humble in accepting any praise, her presence was clearly transformational in changing the culture of the team and helping the players to build their confidence. Pippa is now part of a senior leadership team for the global Right to Dream group, working on cultural strategy. Pippa's worked across the world in a range of sports, from swimming and rugby through to Australian rules football and soccer. She's also the author of an extraordinary book that I loved, Fear Less: How to Win at Life Without Losing Yourself. I had heard that Pippa had faced some real challenges growing up, so I asked her to tell me about life at home.
Well, I grew up in Yorkshire, in a place called Harrogate in North Yorkshire, and my early childhood was awesome, amazing. You know, had a really close, loving relationship with my mum and my nan, especially. Mum was a single mum when she had me. She was 19. You know, I remember that very fondly. She got married when I was 5, subsequently had 3 brothers and sisters. That sort of, so early years up to being 12 or so were really nice, like a regular English childhood. I look back fondly, but things disintegrated. My stepfather was an alcoholic, and their marriage disintegrated, and it was really a struggle. She was a single mum with 4 kids, you know, no resources, working all the time. I was a kind of a pseudo parent from the age of 12 for my siblings. Where I look back now, and I had really a whole heap of responsibility that a teenager wouldn't normally have. And she got into a subsequent relationship later. Probably she would reflect, I think, when she was, you know, already overwhelmed and at the end of a tether. And she got into a relationship which was violent, and that unraveled everything for us. So, you know, through that sort of period in the lead up to me being 16, she was, you know, in this violent relationship, and he lived in a home with us. And sort of any person who's grown up with violence in the home and where there's been alcoholism and, you know, the layers of trauma that lays down for a young person and in fact for the mum, the parent, you know, it's very complex stuff. But what you feel as a teenager is angry and abandoned and confused. And, you know, I think what happened for me at that point was I just became fierce and bold, but in a way that was about rejecting the status quo and being sort of determined to forge my own path. And I was sort of generally annoyed with life, you know, and it served as a reasonable motivator for survival at that point of time. But, you know, I've learned subsequently that that's not the best place to place that sort of energy. It was a mess. And I left home at 16, couch surfed for a bit, was sort of officially homeless for a little bit. And I thought, well, this isn't going to work out. So I always had some kind of push in me, some sort of really resistance to getting stuck, I think, which, you know, maybe that came from the kind of childhood I'd had. Found a bedsit eventually, and I had, 5 jobs. Wow. 1 full-time and 4 part-time jobs that kind of went from 6 a.m. till midnight. Just, I think, with a determination that this wasn't going to be the way it was, even though I had no idea of direction. Something in me always was pulled back to the education. I'm a real natural learner. I am curious as a human being. And I was pulled back to education, and I went to college in York no idea what I wanted to do, but I'd gone and done a BTEC in leisure or something, which was probably about the easiest option for me in front of me at that point in time. And I didn't have a sense of myself or whether I was really capable or intelligent at much. I just felt this sort of fire of emotion in me and determination to move. But in that course, I met a brilliant teacher who was a really interesting woman. And she convinced me over the course of a couple of years that I was smart and that I could definitely go to university. And that was a radical idea for me. It's like, what? As if nobody in my family had ever been to university. And it just wasn't anything I'd thought about. But I got excited by it. She helped me apply to various universities, and Loughborough accepted me. And it was like, the world had opened up. I thought I'd arrived at that point. Then I started that journey at Loughborough University where, you're living in residencies, and I was completely immersed in different kinds of people than I'd ever met, with different views about how life might work out. And, while I was still pretty lost and confused in some ways, I really found some anchors. I found basketball, which I played there. I found study, which I really enjoyed. And I found a bunch of mates that, were and still are anchors for me through that journey. And I guess I started to grow up about that time. But, long journey from there to fully growing up, I think.
Yeah, that's amazing, isn't it? And I guess to get to university from, as you say, that kind of BTEC approach and somewhere like Loughborough. I'm obviously a graduate myself, so a massive fan of. I should ask you what hall you were in, actually. What hall were you in?
Evelyn Richards.
Oh yeah, I was a Faraday girl.
Were you?
But that's amazing. And I guess that transition then and into sport. So how did you end up then from actually, what did you study at Loughborough, and then how did you end up, I guess, moving on into getting out to Australia? What was that process?
I studied sports science, which I had no idea what it was when I went, but it sounded really interesting. Sports science and social science with an emphasis on the psychology. So I did a joint honours. And, that was, I think back to that now, given that I had no idea really, that the step into that was pretty over optimistic for me. Unfortunately, I was well suited to it. But, I really like that blend of the sports science and the social science, because I've always been interested in what sport does for us and who we are while we're in it. So it really worked nicely. And that was my first taste of sports psychology too. So I did that. I graduated and did the obligatory year travel. And I was going with a girlfriend who I played basketball with, and she couldn't go because her father was retrenched, and so she had to pull out. And so I had this choice: am I going on my own or am I not going? And so I went on my own. But that was really formative, to travel on your own and be terrified half the time, and really find a different view of the world in other places as well. So when I came back, I ended up working in a basketball, netball, volleyball centre that was a commercial venture up in Reddish near Stockport.
Oh, wow, yeah.
That a basketball friend had put me in touch with, the opportunity there. And, I was the person who was charged with filling the centre with people. So it's kind of like a sport development role, program role, first gig after traveling. And it was fun. And it was an Australian company. And after about a year, there was an opportunity to go and do the same thing in Adelaide, in Australia, with a new centre that was opening. And I was like, yes, please. So that's how I ended up in Australia. And then, 1 year led to another and another. And then I built a life there, and picked up some more study and sort of found my way into sports psychology and the doctoral studies eventually in Melbourne. So, that was my entry point to Australia.
Excellent. And I'd like to talk to you a little bit about that first role of working with football players in Aussie rules. I guess Australian men from the outset, especially Aussie rules players, not well known for talking about feelings and perhaps showing vulnerable sides. So how do you even begin to change the culture of a sport that's perhaps founded almost on that slightly unhealthy, but hyper-masculinity? So what was your process in working in that environment?
Yeah, there was sort of a couple of threads to it. The first job I had in football was that with the AFL Players Association. So it was kind of the organisation that was known as the support structure for players and for their off-field life, for the conditions of their employment, but also for their off-field life. So, we tackled things like depression, drug policy, and what people understood about addiction. We tackled things like well-being in the sport and transitions and that kind of thing. So it was a great position to stand in front of a group of Aussie Rules players and talk, because it was something that was about their future, their well-being, what was advantageous for them. So I think it was easy because I was Players Association.
Yeah.
But, you would walk into a room of 40-something guys with arms folded looking at you like, what is she talking about? Many times. But I think I had conviction about what I was talking about. And the other thing I know for sure, working with many, many young male athletes over time, is that the way they are in the room talking one-on-one is very different to the way they are in the group and the locker room, as they say. So I always found that when they got through the door and you had a very human, trusting conversation with them, that they didn't bring bravado and machismo and all the rest. They wanted to talk about stuff. They might not show that publicly. That took much longer to break down some of those hyper-masculine stereotypes. But, the truth of the matter is, especially around mental health, that people are hurting. So we use the angle often of, what would you want this to be for your mate who's sitting next to you? If you don't feel comfortable talking about it yourself, can you talk about it for him?
Yeah.
And so that, because there's a very strong sort of sense of mateship and, teamship among Australian teams, I think probably true of all teams. So that was the angle in. And actually I, with the exception of a few rules, I always felt quite well respected and regarded in those environments with the players. I've had my experiences with the institutions and, the organisations that have been more ostracising or lonelier as a woman. But generally, the machismo among the players, they're young people with really solid intentions most of the time and not necessarily the tools to communicate. So once you get under that and you stay confident, I think it gives them an opportunity to be who they actually are.
Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it? I know when we say the name Dr. Pippa Grange, many people think of you as the person that came in and transformed the attitude of the England football team and helped them to eventually win that penalty shootouts. But you didn't kind of bite their hands off at the offer of a role or the first approach. So can you tell us a little bit about that and why that was, really?
Well, I was in LA at the time. As I built my own business, I worked with sports clients and business clients. And one of my business clients had asked me to come work internally in their organization for a couple of years, which ended up being 3 years, to help them build people and culture work, bring the psychology to the people and culture work, which was fun. And I ended up in LA doing that. So I was kind of in that, and I was starting to get a bit itchy about, well, what's next, and missing that, it's deeply intensive in sort of corporate life, and business is different to sport. And I was thinking, I do miss it a bit, but at the same time, I felt quite relieved to be out of it for a minute, because it's sports intense too. And I had a call from Dave Sleman at Elite Performance Partners saying, we have a client who's interested in a psychologist. We didn't say the client, but work with a very high name, a big name brand, to change culture and to work on the psychology. And I said to him at the time, I'm not really interested in a hands-on psych job, pitch side, poolside anymore. I felt like I'd done that kind of thing. And it's a particular lifestyle, to be on camps or at games all the time. And I kind of felt like that's not where I was. But I kept talking to him, and, as we got further and further, and he sort of, we were at a position where he could tell me who the client was. And he told me, the FA in England, and my immediate impression was like, oh God, no. That sounds awful, because it had such a terrible external reputation.
Yeah.
But actually, the more you explored internally, there'd been some really great work done by people like Dan Ashworth and Dave Reddin and a number of others around the place, Matt Crocker, that had done good work on restructuring and revisioning what it could look like. And they had a really strong understanding about the missing piece in culture and people. So, I kind of got swayed into it. And then I came to the assessment centre, which felt like it was about four weeks long. It was 2 days long and very intense. But I just had fun with it. And I met Gareth, the coach. And, when I started the role, the idea was that I would run the department, not be personally within a team. But it was end of November 2017 by the time I started, because I was relocating. And we just didn't have time to bring somebody else in before prep camp for World Cup. So I wasn't ever supposed to be that psych.
Right.
I was supposed to be running the department with that psych working with me. So I stepped into the breach, so to speak. And I think because Gareth's open-minded, because so much good work had already been done. Owen Eastwood had been in there doing some fantastic work on identity, and Lane Ford had been in there doing some sort of foundational work. So it was ripe, really, to make some decent shifts and go much deeper on sort of, what are the conditions for winning? Not how do you take a penalty kick? Actually, that's the smallest slice of the work. But what are the conditions required for 8 weeks on the road to be winning, and to keep everybody in a state where they could win? That was the work. And I look back at that now, and, the external world imagines this kind of guru out the front doing some kind of mind trickery to help somebody take penalties. It's the tiniest piece. But I did a lot of work with the coach and the staff group. And I did a lot of work to keep the conditions possible for the way it transpired, and to bring different energies into camp. So, I felt really weird at the end of that, because the media had made a hero out of me, which is a difficult thing to experience within an elite sport anyway, because tall poppies don't go well. Mm-hmm. And I was new. And I felt really awkward about that. And I think it did create some tension. I never said a word through the whole thing.
Yeah. I tried to get you on the podcast, I think, at the time, and then it was like, there's a definite no from the FA from you.
There was a definite no from the FA, but there was a no from me too. Yeah. I still felt very new in the environment, very rookie, and I felt like I'd had a window and it had gone really well. But I knew I hadn't created all of that. But the story that the media wants is a hero.
Yeah.
So I became it, and it was a bit weird, actually. And I felt very reluctant, but I also felt really rewarded that we'd been able to have some conversations that had never been had.
Yeah.
And tackle some subjects about who we were and what that badge meant that hadn't been had for a long time, or that had been contemporized. And they really needed to be contemporized for the young people who are in that team now. So the work was enjoyable with the team. And then, after the World Cup, I was still with the team because we still hadn't found that right person to come in, and running the department across 16 teams across men's and women's. And I had at one point there was 11 psychs or culture coaches working with us, which was really awesome for a period of time. And then there was a restructure, and it became, the agenda shifted a bit to be much more performance focused, less culture focused, and an amalgamation of departments that sort of brought it more into data evidence, traditional sort of pitch psych and, well-being, and less away from that thing that I feel like over 25 years I've been developing as niche around, redefining and success and winning and attitudes about winning and mental freedom. So I kind of felt, okay, I don't want to go further up this ladder. This is, I respect what they're doing, and I really felt fortunate to have that opportunity, but my ladder's maybe up a different wall.
Yeah.
So yeah, I took my leave at that point and jumped over to Right to Dream.
And when you look back now, do you feel that culture you helped create has been retained? It's obviously harder to see that externally, but do you feel the teams and people department doesn't exist anymore, and things have changed, but what do you feel?
You're right. It's too hard to sort of comment on it from outside. I'm still, regularly in touch with the people who are in there. There's some brilliant people working in that at St George's Park, and I have the greatest respect for them. But I think that the focus has changed a bit away from that work. But I hope that some of it's retained, and things have their own. momentum. So it's taken its own personality and evolved its own way in good ways. And some of the same people are there. So a lot of the same people are there. So I'm sure there's rich stuff that emerged while I was there with those people that still retain. So it's not something I did that was a blueprint that's the way.
Yeah.
Things have their own legs, and they grow their own way. But, it's part of being a catalyst or a spark for a way of seeing things, maybe.
Excellent. You've written this incredible book, Fearless, How to Win at Life Without Losing Yourself. And I genuinely feel it might have changed my life at 55. I bought so many copies for friends and for my daughters and family and things as well. So you open with a really strong statement. What if I told you your life was run by fear? So can you talk to us, I guess, without giving away the whole book, but a little bit about that premise?
Yeah. Well, firstly, thank you. I'm really pleased it's meant something to you. That was the whole point of writing it. I think that we underestimate the role that fear plays in our lives, in our psychology. I sort of distinguish types of fear. I talk about in the moment fear, which, we're all familiar with, that shows up and gives us an adrenaline prickle down the knees and in the back of the neck kind of thing that we all experience one way or another on an occasional or regular basis. That's one thing. But I think that there is another kind of fear that has become so culturally enmeshed in our psychology, and that's the fear of not being good enough. And I think that's pervasive in all of our lives on a very regular basis. So we have this fear is very natural. We don't want to be without it. What we need to do is make sure that the amount, the dose, is right. It's not a poisonous dose to our psychology. So hence fear less, not fearless. So, I think it does run all of our lives. It's there and prevalent and needed, but it's culturally high volume in lots of our institutions, our environments, our relationships, our sense of ourself. I describe it in the book as being a bit sneaky. It doesn't always show up and be really immediately visible as fear. It might show up as envy or jealousy. It might show up as perfectionism and the need to control. It might show up as a preference to stay small and separate and not be revealed. So there's lots of different sort of twists and turns it takes. And I think when we look at how we experience ourselves in life and you see it from that angle, fear is really prevalent. And my objective isn't to help people get rid of it or just soothe it and quieten it and turn away. Is to actually really understand how it's showing up in your life and what it's costing you, what each fear journey is costing you, and then what you might do to think about replacing it with something that's stronger or more hopeful for you.
And that process, was there a moment in time when you realised the impact that fear can have on lives, or is that something that you've accrued over your time of working with teams and sports and so on?
Yeah, kind of a bit like the sort of, the thing I was saying before about there is no silver bullet template or understanding or moment. There are things that show up for you that really illuminate what you kind of know in your gut. But for me, it was an accumulation of examples over many years. And when I was in Australia, maybe about 10 years ago, a bit longer now, I started to notice that the people I was working with, whether they were sort of boardroom or change room, they had the same patterning of fear of not being good enough. Even those people who were, you or I would look in and go, that's a massively successful winner, but the experience of their success still was coloured by that fear of not being good enough. And I started to realise that it was actually stealing everybody's joy in sport or in winning. So it's a pattern that accrued over a long time for me, and I thought that's maybe the thing to work on.
I'm fascinated by so many of your methods, and you kind of give some fantastic examples throughout the book. And one I was really intrigued with is that Triple H exercise. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, it was first devised in Atlanta Falcons NFL. I think it was Mike Smith and John Gordon who'd sort of devised this or tried this out. And the idea of it is, how do you play for your team if you don't know your team, right? And it's the idea of intimacy, which we've kind of made intimacy far too narrow in our understanding as just something that happens between, partners or lovers or deep friends, right? But intimacy is basically, it just means showing up as you, authentically as you, without the mask on, and being vulnerable enough to do that. And it's a big deal. And I personally feel, and they felt, that if you can bring intimacy into a team and people can actually know each other at some level, you are going to really have so much more opportunity to have the kind of bond that works on the pitch. So Triple H is standing up in front of the group and telling a story of a hero, a highlight, and a hardship from your own life. And Enrichment Tigers that I talk about in the book, it can be, they tell all sorts. It leaves the imagination to the individual. You say what, if you told me you're 3, they're going to be very different to the next person. So it's very personal. I've seen people who are the bravest, toughest individuals out in the field and who would be bold enough to say what they thought about anything, in a social setting. But talking about themselves and those 3 H's took them into such a vulnerable zone. And they'd sort of, rather poke their eye out than stand in front of other people and talk. But even though they were terrified, I didn't do it. Shane McCurry did it, who came after me. As a dear friend. He came after me at Richmond Tigers. But the train of that thinking around intimacy and bringing that into the team has sort of had a long tail. And when they stood up and told those stories, they were horrified and terrified for weeks beforehand. But absolutely every time, 40 other people in the room would go and give them a hug and just say, "We love you," afterwards, and feel respect and endearment and notice the person's courage in being vulnerable, which for me is just such a massive underrated bridge to performance. So it really shifts things, I think, when you can bring that kind of intimacy into a team. Most times we don't. We're way too performative. We're way too, we manage the impression we make very tightly.
And is that something that you then take into the business environment too?
100%.
That works? Okay, interesting.
Yeah, definitely. The ability to have real conversations rather than carefully craft your words to get a result, which means you're always in performance, it's always theatre, and you never actually get to that stuff that is the real performance unlock, whether that's bond, team, alignment, unlocking somebody's creativity or willingness to take the risks to solve a problem in a different way. That it needs intimacy. Intimacy and some kind of safety. Amy Edmondson's work on psychological safety is brilliant around that. But, I think she doesn't use the word, but I think when she's explaining it, she's also talking about the ability to freely express who you are. And for me, when you do that with another person, you and I are doing it right now, right? That's intimacy.
Yeah. It's so powerful, isn't it? And does that come, I guess you need to get the players on board to share that, but clearly on a hierarchical basis, it's about getting the buy-in from that, it's the structure of a senior management and team. And where does the blockage occur for you when you go into an environment to create that?
Everywhere. Everybody's always terrified of it. They might think it's a great idea, but, if I give an example of an organization that I've worked with doing something similar, I always ask the boss to go first, so, that person showing up without their power armor on, even if they're much loved and well liked and don't think that they use power in a negative way, the idea of being the boss and the performance that goes with being the boss is really hard for them to take the armor off and say, I want to tell you about my grandma, or I want to tell you about when I really had a hard time.
Yeah.
But it unlocks something huge. But I start at the top and ask the boss first. And so then that gives a natural permission and an encouragement, but it really needs some strong facilitation to do it well. And then the emotional energy that comes through it, even if you're in the kind of hyper-masculine environment that you talked about before, where there's a lot of closed body posture and eyes down kind of thing, I absolutely know that they're going to put their arm around somebody in the corridor afterwards or say, "That was brave, mate. I wouldn't have done that." Or whatever it is, that it starts a momentum of energy towards something much more useful
Absolutely fascinating, isn't it? You've been in sport for so much of your working life, and it's that discipline that is so focused on outcome, so results and the scoreboard, and it's easy to see how athletes put so much of their worth into the results that they create. So how do you begin to break down that for them and create that change in what sport's about for them?
I think that it's an exploration. It's not that I bring a new way of looking at it. What I try and do is create the conditions for them to look at what feels right. Because again, it's not my template. It's not my idea. It's what I've tried to do with the book too. It's like, how can I provoke your thought about what actually feels right for you, or better, stronger for you, and what is the cost of your journey if you're doing it differently in a way that you don't want to. So I think, I try and create conditions to discuss or to explore or to play. Play is massively underrated, or to connect, and sometimes it's really subtle. It's not just like, okay, there's going to be a big, scary meeting, everybody in a circle, and we're going to have to reveal ourselves and talk about our mothers. It's like, it's too terrifying. So you can do it much more subtly than that. Triple H is a really great example. But as I said, there'd been a big run up to that. It wasn't like day one.
Everybody in.
Yeah. It's like, I'd be horrified doing that. So I think you have to just continually think about what conditions and environments and culture am I creating? Are we creating on the daily that is helping people be freer mentally, psychologically? Because that's the stuff.
And is there a different approach for different sports? So you've worked across, Aussie rules and rugby league and swimming and so on, and also with different genders. Do you find it different working with female teams to male teams?
I think if you ask about individuals, female athletes versus male athletes, I see quite a lot of difference in emotional tone, perhaps, or men sometimes feeling that they have to be more performative and kind of reluctant when it comes to sharing emotions. But in teams, female teams too often, in my view, share the norms of that sort of performative, keep it all in, talk about it when we're out of sight, don't say what you really feel and mean because you don't want to be seen as weak or less committed or whatever else. So I still find that there's still quite a single archetype of how to be in a team, and that's something I'd really love to see change over the coming years, that there can be more individuality and emotional freedom for people in teams. It doesn't have to look a certain way. I think we're a bit stuck in a template of how it looks.
And you talked about a huge amount of the work that you've done in the past, but you exposed bullying culture at Australian swimming back in 2012. And that's certainly something we've been hearing more about recently in sports like gymnastics and athletics, and then some para sports in the GB team too. We talk about that kind of myth that fear is the best motivator, which is certainly something that we see in sport. So how do you feel coaches can get the most from their athletes without that, need to intimidate them, or the belief that they need to intimidate them?
Yeah, great question. It is a myth, isn't it? It's a sticky one. I mean, if you think about the premise of the book, fear is always with us. We don't need to add more. You will bring your own if you are the performer, right? It's actually more about channeling it in a useful way. I think what happens is that the coach feels fear and transmits it, passes it on, because that sort of need to feel like all the edges are tucked in and everything's going to be controlled, and they need to push that person towards their goal is just an underestimation, or I've used the term lazy before, and that's probably not quite right. It's a underexplored way of doing it. So fear will lift your game for the next 15 minutes, let's say, because of effort. But actually, there's so much cost, psychological and physiological cost of elevated fear. It just doesn't work as the motivator. everything from narrowed vision, from changed physiology, from a dump of cortisol, which is going to have an effect half an hour after that, to, the anxiety and the track running in the back of your mind about don't mess up, which is this bucket of attention that you have to apply to the task in front of you, whether it's a penalty kick or, the next phase of a game or whatever else. The bucket of attention you have to apply is narrowed because half of it's spent on don't stuff up. And also the experience is awful. So what somebody is trying to do when they do that is make sure that the person's focused, make sure that a person is bringing right effort, that they are applying their talent to the task. There are different ways of doing that are about discipline, which is very relevant, and focus and attention and confidence. Fear does not lift confidence. It takes it in the opposite direction. So I think, yes, we've got many examples of somebody getting as they say in Australia, a halftime spray from the coach and it resulting in something. But most of the time that's out of effort and then momentum. The momentum of the game might shift or change. And it's, we see that as the way, but there's a lot of luck in that. I think the more precise or skilled way of doing that is driving attention, discipline, and confidence. So I just find it very limited as a ledger of cost benefit. It usually doesn't stack up and it feels rubbish.
I guess there's so much fascinating in the book, but I did find that the physiological effect of fear and the decision-making and all those elements was quite extraordinary to read and understand about that. So do you think sports and coaches are beginning to understand that? Are things changing in attitudes? Books like yours obviously will help that and spread the word, but do you feel we're in a more positive place in terms of the way we coach athletes?
I think there's some amazing progress happening in that, and like any other sort of big psychological shift, it takes a bit of time. It takes a bit of courage to keep experimenting. But I see some very cool things that, inspire me or lift me, especially where women are coaching, that are different, and that willingness to step in and say, well, I don't really work like that. So why would other human beings work like that? That's why in the book I talk about see, face, replay. So you have to really stop a bit longer and see what's going on for you and see where fear is kicking around in the corners. And I am a bit, that is anxiety speaking in me. That is a fear of not being good enough. And then what's it costing? And then, bringing that into the room. So it's a male example, but Steve Kerr as Golden State Warriors, I really love his coaching methodology and philosophy because, their values include joy and compassion too. I think that he really coaches the human being, not just the tactics or the game. And if we really think about how human beings operate, then this stuff it's a journey. Like, how do we grow? How do we open up? How do we step into a bit more vulnerability for performance? It's not an either or proposition. I think people think if I'm vulnerable, I'm going to do all the soft stuff. I'm going to lose focus on the win. My sort of central message is no, that it's about method. The win is there for the taking. It will still involve blood, sweat, and tears. Yeah. It will still involve all the grit and all the work, but the tone is what we need to change. And fear is in the tone.
Excellent. Well, so much of your work has been undoing years of athletes focused on results and judging their sense of worth by their achievements in a pitch or in a pool. But with Right to Dream, it seems you're helping athletes to shape their sport in a very different way, right from the start, from the outset. So I'd love you to tell me a little bit more about Right to Dream and your work with the organisation too.
Yeah. I think the sort of central part of the model for Right to Dream is that there is the triangle of learning or development is football development, educational or academic development, and character, which as a young person matures into sort of a pro player, that becomes purpose, character and purpose. How do you want the things that you know about yourself, your own identity, to drive how you act in the world, and especially how you act in the world for others. life outside your own window. So the model from 10 years old, when a kid joins one of our academies, especially our residential academies, which at the moment is in Ghana and will soon be in Egypt, is that triangle is the basis of the learning. I don't want to over romanticize it, because they're also young people who are aspiring to pro football, and they will move into very sort of high end education in the US or the UK. So they enter what we, inverted commas, call elite environments, where there is masses of this kind of structure and orientation to outcome. So we have to prepare them for that as well. But, so those aspects of resilience and discipline and self-belief and self-focus, and all those things really matter. But we hope that we also give them a rounded sense of who they are as a human being. And they live in a multiverse, as we say, not just a single universe of I am only a success if I play pro football for 10 years. How else do you bring richness and success into your life for you and for others? How are you part of the world outside of performance? So that's kind of a big piece of it. And we're expanding at the moment and trying to take that sort of redefined idea of excellence to other places for people to experiment and explore with as well.
What's your role with Right to Dream?
I'm Chief Culture Officer. So in another organisation, that's just, it's on the executive.
Excellent. As we've alluded to, many perceptions of leadership are associated with more traditionally male attributes, such as authority and dominance. And yet we're seeing amazing women like Jacinda Ardern in a very different way, leading with compassion and respect, and that authentic area that we talked about earlier. So what advice would you give to women who are taking on leadership roles now around the attributes that they adopt?
Jacinda Ardern is a great example, because for me, she is it's about what is her and. She has got swathes of authority. If you think about what she got done in her first term with the first terrorist attack on New Zealand soil and COVID, and, achieved massive things with influence and authority. She didn't just show up with compassion, right? She had those other things. Dominance, I think, is the one that we can kick to the curb. That, ideas of dominance and comparison are the draining, exhausting, not very useful things that are part of leadership, that we have to conquer and dominate the other.
Yeah.
But I think that Jacinda Ardern, or, we might look at closer to home, and Emma Hayes as a coach as well.
Yeah.
She's got authority. She's got credibility. I would do what she told me. And it's not just because she shows up with charisma and compassion. It's an and. It's what you add from that original classic kind of outdated archetype. How do you bring those other things? But I think that orientation for any leader is, if you start by thinking about what am I trying to achieve and who am I trying to achieve it with and for, and go back to the human perspective and think what moves the human. And most of the time it is not going to be those hardcore things about dominance and comparison. They're short-lived, like fear, like the idea of, a fearful halftime talk. It's leadership attributes that are deep resilience, persistence, compassion, open-mindedness. Like, can I hear my leader learning? Can I hear my leader listening? Can I see flex in them? When we think about, sometimes I think when we talk about resilience as a leadership factor, we're still thinking about toughness. Can they bounce back? Right? It's just one aspect. When I think resilience, I'm thinking the difference between toughness, which is like a concrete block, immovable, no flex, and a flexible sheet of steel, which is resilience. Like, can it bend and come back? Can it take a different shape if the environment or the context needs it? Or is it rigid, hard, tough, immovable, no give in it? I think they're the things for contemporary leadership that are just really high value.
It's fascinating. And I guess just finally, clearly you've had amazing success career-wise, and the book's had huge success too. But what's next in terms of your personal ambitions for the future?
I would like to, I've spent sort of 25 years in sport, and the reality is that the majority of my emphasis has been working in male teams. And I would like to have a broader conversation. I would like to see how we can curate and create a different archetype for women working in sport, but also for men who might embrace more of the feminine and, get rid of some of that old sort of stuck, tough archetype that we've just been talking about. So that's important to me. And I'd really like us to broaden out and be a bit more imaginative about this idea of winning and success and what that looks like. So, there's parts of that I hope to be able to do through the role with Right to Dream, but there's also parts of it that are being able to contribute a little bit to a broader conversation about who we are and how we live.
Wow, what an incredible woman. It's clear to see why Pippa's had such an enormous impact across her life. I loved hearing about Pippa's link to Loughborough University. Other trailblazing guests on this podcast who studied or lectured there include football legend Jill Scott, British Paralympic champion Baroness Tanni Gray-Thompson, head of women's football at the FA, Dame Sue Campbell, and the CEO of the Youth Sport Trust, Ali Oliver. If you'd like to know more about the other work I do, including the Women's Sport Collective, a network for all women working in sport, please visit fearlesswomen.co.uk. This is also where you can find out more about all my incredible guests from this and the previous series, and you can also listen to the podcast from the website too. You can also sign up to Changing the Game, our free weekly newsletter that highlights all the latest developments in the world of women's sport. Thanks again to Barclays for their kind support of the Game Changers, to Sam Walker, our executive producer, Rory Alskery on sound production, and Kate Hannon behind the scenes making sure everything runs smoothly. Next week, in the final episode of this series, I'm so excited to talk to Laura Woods. Recently voted the SJA Sports Presenter of the Year, Laura is a regular on Sky Sports and the host of TalkSport's flagship Sports Breakfast, one of the most listened to shows in the UK. Laura talks very openly about her journey from being a runner at Sky Sports in 2009, working her way up through the broadcasting ladder in production before moving in front of the camera. Laura's outgoing nature and her unflappable personality make her one of the most in-demand sports presenters right now.
It's like walking down a road with a load of potholes, and sometimes you can skip over them and sometimes they completely suck you up. I find the kind of get back in the kitchen comments, I find those, they annoy me a little bit, but then sometimes I'm kind of like, well, that's such an old joke. And if you haven't come up with anything new for the last however many years, I feel sorry for you. If your opinion of a woman is genuinely that she needs to stay in the kitchen, you haven't evolved either. Like, what are you doing,
The Game Changers. Fearless women in sport.